turned 18, I planned on nothing less than total reinvention. So I started growing my hair out long. Growing my hair out long. Now 1 year later, I can feel my commitment wavering. Just wanna prove I can pull through on something, pull through on anything.
Then I'll hit 20, holding steady, screaming high school songs in the back of the car park. Can't hit the high notes, but I'm learning to sit better in my flaws. And in 10 years our adolescent heartache won't mean a thing. But until then we'll keep the choir singing.
To the tune of every song we sung when we were 17. I'd like to say I'm more poetic now, but most my songs are still about a girl who probably doesn't think of me. And honestly, why should she? Oh, why should she? Why should she? Now I'm responsible for all my actions, all these flawed chain reactions in my brain probably won't go away, so I'll just move on to better days, and better headaches, and better headaches.
I pressed the pause button, so I don't know why it played the next song. Fucking annoying. But anyway, hello! It has been a while since I've streamed. I've been just so fucking busy these past few weeks. But I was like, I have some time to stream today, so that is what I shall do. So, is the music too loud? I feel like it might be too loud, but I'm not too sure. I just realized that I had my audio output capture muted, so, you couldn't hear the music. Fixed it. Never mind. I think it might be okay. Perhaps. What if I do that? There we go. That might be a little bit better. Maybe a bit quieter. Like that. There we go. So today I'm finally doing what I said I would do for a while, and that's reading Through a Glass Divine by Bones and the Bees. We finished reading The Stars and Their Children. Amazing, amazing story. And I want more Bones and the Bees. I want my Bones and the Bees fix. So we're gonna be reading chapter 1 of Through a Glass Divine. And if you're new to my stream and you enjoy my content, be sure to drop a follow, because I don't have a follower goal. I'm gonna be real. But, and if you want to see my other socials, they're there. I think the link to the Discord server is expired again. I'll have to fix that at some point. But yeah, let's get started, shall we? Hi, Bee! We're reading News Story today. Yeah, this is the fic with the Oracle. Where is... It's right here. There we go. It's a bit of an earlier, fic reading stream today because I have a rehearsal, a dress rehearsal, in about a little less than 2 hours. And I didn't want to do a really, really late stream. Good luck, thanks. Alright. Through a Glass Divine by Bones and the Bees. Summary. The guard stared at him for a moment, blue eyes blown wide behind his mask. It was then that Pythia looked down at the hand outstretched between them. The prosthetic was made of intricately carved metal, covered in vines and flowers, twisting together with the shimmer of enchantments reflecting in the purple glow. And although the guard's sleeve was covering his wrist... You can't stay? Okay. I hope you have a good day. And although the guard's sleeve was covering his wrist, he knew that in the place where metal met flesh, there was a pair of dark angel wings tattooed on his skin. He was right. This wasn't a real guard. This was a deathling. Or, Wilbur is an oracle known as the Pythia, chosen to receive dreams of the future from the goddess Clara. One day, he receives a dream warning him that during a ball Emperor Schlatt is hosting, the Deathlings, terrorists who worship the goddess of death, will launch an attack. When his warning goes ignored, he knows there's going to be consequences. He doesn't expect one of those consequences to include him getting kidnapped by a teenager, aka a cyberpunk fantasy fusion AU with lots of religious trauma. We love religious trauma. So, explanation, this is both a rewrite and a continuation of a fic I wrote last year. You don't need to read the original to understand this one. You might be better off not reading it at all. Chapter 1. A Mark of Death. A sea of shifting colors. Expensive gowns, glittering jewelry, glowing cybernetics. A kaleidoscope of wealth surrounding him, drowning him. Glass shattering. Gunshots. Screams. So many screams. A hand gripping his wrist tight enough to bruise. It pulls him away from the sea of wealth. Pulls him into the shadows. The hand itself. Vines and flowers carved into a deep purple metal, shimmering with enchantments. It's nothing like he's seen before. Right above the metal, at the place where prosthetic meets flesh, there's a tattoo. Angel wings as dark as night, stark against a pale wrist. He's pulled deeper into the darkness, until he can't see anything at all. He's lost. The Pythia gasped for air as he bolted upright in his bed. Disjointed images flashed behind his eyes. The colors, the hand, the tattoo. Screams echoed in his ears, making him grimace as he reached for the tablet that sat on the nightstand beside his bed. He wrote down the details of the dream as quickly as he could, before they could fade into the haze of his memories. His heart pounded in his ears as he typed out the description of the tattoo. because he knew exactly what that meant. It was nothing good. Once he was done writing down the dream, he breathed a sigh of relief and slumped back against his pillows. His eyes drifted up to the ceiling, staring at the smooth marble arching high above his bed. Then, he shifted to his side, gaze falling on the morning sunlight drifting through the window beside his bed. A thriving metropolis buzzed with life past the glass. Towering skyscrapers glittered in the light of dawn, while sleek maglev trains raced between the buildings. He stared at the view for a moment, before pushing back his blankets to climb out of bed. The marble floor was cool beneath his feet as he padded over to the window. He looked out at the city below, trying to make out any individual people in the crowd swelling the sidewalks with many stories below. It was no use, though. It was just a sea of color to him. He was too high up to actually see anyone's faces. After allowing himself a moment, he moved away from the window and across the room. He passed the bed, stepping between the archway that separated his bedroom and the rest of his quarters. He dragged a hand down his face as he made his way to the intercom that sat next to the door, trying to rub the sleep out of his eyes as he pressed a button to call a guard. "Is there something you need, Your Grace?" the static-tinged voice of the guard asked. "I've received a vision and it's of the utmost importance. Tell His Royal Highness to come see me immediately," the Pythia replied, his own voice rough with sleep. "Oh." The guard made a surprised noise. "Of course, Your Grace. I'll summon him right away." "Thank you," he murmured, leaning against the wall. "May Clara bless you," the guard told him, "and may she guide your path," the Pythia finished. With that, the intercom went silent, and the Pythia groaned as he slumped further into the marble. The low buzz of anxiety was already settling itself under his skin, lighting his nerves on fire as he tried to figure out how he was going to explain his dream. The Emperor wouldn't be happy about this. He didn't need future vision to know that. He allowed himself one beat, and then another. Then, he forced himself away from the wall so he could prepare to see the Emperor. Walking back into his bedroom, he passed the windows again, not sparing a glance at the city as he hurried to the bathroom door across from his bed. He went straight for the sink, splashing cool water on his face to try and chase away the groggy haze that always settled over him after a vision. It didn't do much, but the cool water was soothing to say the least. He lifted his head, flinching when he met his own eyes in the mirror. He didn't spend much time looking at his reflection, especially not when his eyes were visible. The man in the mirror was familiar, but not at the same time. Brown curls fell over even darker brown eyes, and he frowned when he noticed dark circles hanging under them. It wasn't for lack of sleep, so he found himself wondering why he looked so tired all the time. His gaze lingered for a moment at the reflection that was both his and not at the same time. Then, he shook himself off, reaching into a drawer to pull out a carefully stitched blindfold. Made of white silk and shimmering with enchantments, the blindfold was one of many the Pythia had available to him. He slipped it over his eyes, hands moving out of muscle memory as he tied a knot around the back of his head. His vision flickered, and then the enchantments went into effect, allowing him to see through the fabric with little more than a subtle blur cast over everything around him. He glanced up at the mirror again, his eyes now hidden behind the white and gold embroidery. That would do. As if on cue, a soft chime echoed through his room. Hurrying out of the bathroom, he tapped a button on his tablet to let the guard outside know he was ready, and then made his way back into the main part of his quarters. "Your Highness," the Pythia greeted, bowing his head slightly as the door slid open, allowing the Emperor to step into the room. "Pythia?" Schlatt replied, dipping his head as the door hissed shut behind him. The Emperor was not a slight man by any means, but he was still several inches shorter than the Pythia himself. Still, he stood with his shoulders straight and chin up, mutton chops perfectly trimmed despite the fact that, much like the Pythia, he looked as though he'd only just woken up. His button-up shirt was rumpled, as if he'd slept in it, and he was wearing blue slippers in place of proper shoes. However, the Pythia was still in his pajamas, so Schlatt had him one-upped there. "So," Schlatt said after clapping his hands together, "what have you got for me?" Straight to the point. The Pythia usually preferred that, but today, he wanted anything but to tell the Emperor about his vision. "It's not good," he began, opening up his tablet again to see his notes. "I had a dream about the bull tonight." Schlatt frowned, folding his arms over his chest. "What's wrong with it? Did someone get pissed about the the wine selection?" The Pythia sighed, shaking his head. "This is serious, Schlatt. There's going to be an attack." "Excuse me, what?" Schlatt asked, eyes going wide. "The fuck do you mean by an attack?" Gunshots, screaming, dark wings tattooed against a pale wrist. "The Deathlings," the Pythia declared. "They're going to stage some sort of attack, and people might die." At this, Schlatt's frown deepened. "The Deathlings? You mean they're still kicking?" The Pythia nodded. "Apparently so. I saw the Deathlings mark." A beat passed as Schlatt considered this. The Pythia set his tablet down on the table, eyes darting around despite the fact that they were hidden behind his blindfold. "Okay, so we'll set up security measures," Schlatt said, folding his arms over his chest. A rock dropped into the Pythia's gut. "No, that won't work. You need to cancel the ball." Another beat. A crease formed between Schlatt's brows. "Look, Pythia, you know we've always worked well together," he began, tapping his knuckles against the glass table. The Pythia considered the weight in his voice. "Yes, I'd like to think we have," he said, feeling as though he was treading on ice. "You know I respect you and your opinions, just as much as I respect Clara herself," Schlatt continued, "but I think you're forgetting one very important part of our arrangement." Tension hung in the air, sliding down the Pythia's throat and threatening to choke him. "What is that?" he asked, his tone careful. Schlatt lifted his eyes from the table to meet the blindfold. "I'm the Emperor here, not you. You're here to act as an advisor to me, but I'm the one who actually makes the hard decisions. I understand that, but I'm telling you, I have a gut feeling that we need to cancel." "We can't cancel!" Schlatt suddenly shouted, cutting him off. "Don't you fucking get it? Everyone's already on their way. Some of the most powerful damn people on the continent are gonna be at that ball tonight. Royals, politicians, businessmen. We can't send them back now. And even if we could, what the fuck would we tell them? That we're scared of a tiny little terrorist group? One we haven't heard a goddamn peep from in years? He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You did your job. You warned me. I'll bump up security and it'll be fine. No, that wouldn't do it. The Pythia couldn't explain how he knew, but a voice in the back of his head was screaming at him not to let Schlatt go through with the ball. That no matter how much security he added, it wouldn't be enough. It won't be fine though, he insisted. I think your guests dying is a worse political situation to deal with than cancelling the damn ball. Schlatt narrowed his eyes. Did you see anyone die? The Pythia hesitated, because technically no, he didn't see anyone die, but he knew what his gut was telling him. What she was telling him. Well, no, but then I don't think we have reason to worry. Frustration had been bubbling up inside of him since Schlatt walked into the room, but to hear such plain dismissal in the Emperor's voice, such a blatant lack of respect for Clara, sent it all boiling over. How the fuck am I supposed to advise you if you don't listen to me? He shouted, barely holding himself back from slamming his hand down on the table. Suddenly, before he could process what was happening, Schlatt was storming towards him until he was only inches from his face. Listen here, dear Pythia, Schlatt hissed, sarcasm dripping from his words when he said the title. Whether you like it or not, you're not the fucking Emperor here. I am. Clara chose you to serve me, not the other way around. So I'd be very careful with how you address me from now on. Do you understand what I'm saying? Schlatt's breath was hot against his face, and he could feel his blood roaring in his ears. He wasn't going to win this fight. No matter how he pleaded, Schlatt was just going to do what he wanted. Like always. You never listened to me, he shot back, his voice low. You have the aid of a little goddess on your side, but you won't listen to what she has to tell you. Well, has the nation fallen into ruin yet? Schlatt asked mockingly, raising an eyebrow at him. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like it's doing pretty fucking swell. That was a lie and they both knew it. But Schlatt was prideful. He refused to admit that the nation was falling apart under his rule, and word of dissent had been spreading through the palace for months. Yet, he was still the one in power. The Pythia was just an advisor. One that could be bragged about and shown off to the other politicians like a canary in a cage. Only thought of as a pretty thing to look at while singing prophecies that were dismissed time and time again. This wasn't a battle he could win. So he forced himself to swallow down his pride and took a step back, dipping his head to Schlatt in deferral. My apologies, Your Highness, he forced out. I'm simply worried about how things might reflect on you if they go as my vision suggested they would. Schlatt huffed as he stepped back. Let me worry about that. Your job tonight is to remind the other royals why they don't fuck with us. Wow them with your magic shit, say some vague stuff about their future, and make sure they know that if they try to move against us, we'll be ready. Got it? Curling his hand into a fist, the Pythia nodded. I understand. Good, Schlatt said, his smirk holding a razor-fine point. I'll leave you to your morning then. I got a party to plan. And with With that, Schlatt turned on his heel, walking out the door without another word. The door hissed shut, and the Pythia was left with only the visions in his mind to keep him company. As the mortal vessel for Clara, you have a connection with her unlike any other. She speaks through you, but you may also speak with her in return. It is up to her if she will answer, but it is never wrong to ask for her guidance when times are difficult. The lesson from the former Pythia echoed in his ears as he hurried down the hall, cerulean marble clicking under his shoes. There were still several hours before the ball, and he was struggling to keep his head above the waves of his anxiety. It was going to go wrong. That was the one thing he was certain of. But visions from Clara were sacred, meant only to be shared between Pythia and the monarch. He couldn't tell another living soul about what was going to happen at the ball. What was the point of knowing the future if he was powerless to influence it? He wasn't sure, but it wasn't his place to know the answer to that. Clara chose him for a reason. That was what he had to remind himself of. His footsteps echoed in time with the guards behind him as the hall opened up into one of the largest chambers in the palace. Sunlight poured in through a crystalline skylight embedded in the marble, bathing the pool of guidance beneath it in gold. The pool of guidance was a shallow pool of water that dominated most of the chamber. Neon holograms of jumping fish were reflected in the rippling surface, along with other holograms of lotus flowers floating just above the small waves. He ignored the pool of guidance, though. Walking past it, he instead went for her statue, sitting opposite one end of the pool. He knelt down at the base of the statue, staring up through his blindfold at the face carved from opalescent stone. Sometimes, he found himself wondering if the face should seem familiar to him. After all, he was a vessel for Clara. He should know her face when he saw it. Yet, he felt no kinship with the statue. In fact, he didn't feel much of anything when he stared into those empty stone eyes. That had to mean something, but he was too afraid to find out what. So he buried that secret deep in his chest and did his best to tell himself he felt a connection as he folded his hands together to pray. Clara, I don't know what to do, he began, his prayer echoing in his mind. He won't listen to me, which means he won't listen to you. Is this a failure on my end? Is there something I can do better to get him to understand? He paused, waiting for an answer. But there was only silence in his mind as he stared up at the empty statue. She never answered his prayers when he was awake. He tried anyway, for lack of knowing what else to do. I would assume this character's Arid, so let's see. What's the difference between praying to the pool of guidance and praying to her statue? A voice behind him suddenly asked. Jolting at the interruption, his head snapped up, and found himself looking at someone completely unfamiliar to him. They wore a red velvet dress that fell to their calves, with billowing sleeves and a deep V-neck at the front. The dress was embroidered with golden snakes, some wrapping around their arms and others trailing up the sides. Higher up, he could see they had dark, curly hair tamed only by a gold circlet, sitting above a pair of pure white eyes. Interesting choice to go with for cybernetics, but it wasn't the strangest thing he'd seen. What he was focused on, though, was the pure wealth this stranger exuded. That and the fact that they were a stranger in the first place. He'd lived in this palace for so long, he recognized nearly every person that stepped through the doors. So seeing a wealthy stranger like this could only mean one thing. They were a guest of the ball tonight. And judging by their clothing, they were a royal guest at that. Before he could respond to their question, they seemed to notice the blindfold wrapping around his eyes, because they immediately stiffened. Oh, you're... I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to intrude on your praying, they said, immediately dropping into a bow as soon as he got to his feet. You don't need to apologize, he quickly reassured them. I didn't realize who you were. I only saw the back of your head, they continued, keeping their head bowed as they straightened back up. I can leave you be if you need time to speak to her. No, it's fine. I was done with my prayers anyway, he reassured. Besides, if I need peace and quiet for my prayers, there are plenty of private places I can go. They nodded, still seeming unsure as they carefully lifted their head. If you're sure it's not a bother, then I'd just like to say it's an honor to meet you, Pythia. He dipped his head to the royal in respect. It's a pleasure to meet you too. He trailed off, still unsure who he was speaking to. You can call me Eret, they introduced, giving him a small smile. Pleasure to meet you, Eret, he said, plastering on the polite smile he used whenever Schlatt made him talk to other royals. I suspect you're here for the ball tonight. Yes, I am. I arrived earlier than expected, so I was taking the day to explore your palace. It's quite beautiful here, they explained, pure white eyes looking around the chamber in wonder. Well, we could agree with them there. It is, he said, tilting his head back up at the statue. To answer your question, typically you pray to the pool of guidance if you have a specific wish for the future you want Clara to grant, or an issue you want her to provide guidance on. The statue is for more general prayers, or if you just wish to speak to her directly. You can speak to her directly? Eret asked, eyes widening. Resisting the urge to flinch, he shook his head. Not exactly. I believe the statue is supposed to act as a direct line, but I don't think most people hear a response. I can't speak of my own experience because, well, I know my experience isn't what most have. His own experience was largely similar to that of a normal Clara worshipper, because he also never spoke with her directly. But that wasn't something the general public needed to know. He was her vessel. In their eyes, he was supposed to be as close to a living version of her as anyone could get. I'm sure it's not, Eret agreed, smiling again. I must admit, you're not exactly what I was expecting the Pythia to be like. At this, his polite smile faltered. What were you expecting? I'm not sure. Maybe an old woman who spoke only in prophecy? They joked. Just to be clear, I don't mean this as an insult. I'm actually pleasantly surprised. You're more normal, is the way I'd phrase it, I suppose. Oh. That made sense. This wasn't the first time he'd met someone who had been expecting the Pythia to be much stranger or more ominous than he actually was. In a way, the assumption wasn't wrong. His predecessor had been more akin to the mental image of what Eret had described. Wrinkled hands grabbing his own, his heart pounding in his chest as she pulled him close, her voice little more than a hiss as she whispered a warning in his ear. This is not an easy life we live, but you were chosen for a reason. Never question her judgment, because she knows more than you or I ever could. I should let you get back to your prayers now, Pythia, Eret suddenly said, startling him out of the memory. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me, and I hope to see you again tonight. I hope to see you too, he replied, almost certain Schlatt was going to pull Eret over to him at one point, judging by how expensive their clothes were. With that, Eret bowed again, before turning to leave the chamber. He watched them leave, ignoring the weight settling on his shoulders whenever he turned his back to the statue of her. The ball was a kaleidoscope of wealth. It was being held in the royal atrium, glass walls overlooking the neon lights of the city in all its evening glory. Crystal chandeliers designed to look like starbursts hung from the ceiling, and the Pythia found himself lost in a sea of luxurious fabrics and glowing cybernetics. From an outsider's point of view, he supposed he was also part of the opulent walking jewelry stands being put on display this evening. For events like these, traditional garb was required for the Pythia. A veil made of twisted pearls and shimmering thread was layered over his head and tucked into the high collar of his shirt. Over the veil, a headpiece made of dangling gold was settled so it covered his eyes, although he still had an enchanted blindfold on under the veil in case the headpiece shifted. His shirt and pants were both white, and a cloak made of sheer glittering fabric was settled over his shoulders and fell to his ankles. It was a bit ridiculous how over the top the entire outfit was. Despite the enchantment on the blindfold, he could barely see through the veil and headpiece, and was mostly relying on the guards forming a circle around him to tell him where to go. According to Schlatt, though, it was better this way. His face was almost entirely hidden behind the veil, and although there were no strict rules in place about a Pythia needing to hide their face, it was better for the Pythia to remain shrouded in mystery. After all, these balls were the only times those outside the palace got to see the Pythia in person. He was meant to be seen as a living representation of Clara, not an individual. Limiting his interactions with outsiders and hiding his face only helped with that. Can Claire tell me what my next year is going to look like? Sometimes, the Pythia found himself wishing he had even less interaction with outsiders than he already did. Once the ball had gotten into full swing, Schlatt wasted no time in dragging over a myriad of the rich and powerful to meet the Pythia. Most of these interactions involved him nodding and muttering some platitudes about whatever special connection to Clara they claimed to have. But a few of these interactions were far more annoying, because some individuals seemed to think he was a glorified fortune teller who could tell them their futures, like the older woman standing in front of him. I suggest praying to Clara for guidance, he told her, forcing a polite lilt into his voice instead of scoffing like he so desperately wanted to do. The woman's brows pinched, her cybernetic eyes glowing gold behind her lace mask as she stared him down. But you have a direct connection to her. Can't you just ask her and tell me? While I do have a connection to Clara, it is up to her what visions I receive, he tried to explain. My role is to advise the Emperor, so the visions she sends me are ones that will benefit the kingdom as a whole. I can't simply look at someone and know what their future is going to be. Her frown deepened, and he got a feeling that she wasn't going to leave unless she got what she was looking for. But, he cut in before she could argue, I will say, when I look at you, I can feel that she's smiling down on you. I'd say that suggests favor in your future. It was a complete lie, but the woman seemed to buy it anyway. Her frown disappeared, replaced with a brilliant smile as she took his hands and squeezed. "Oh, I knew it! Thank you so much!" she exclaimed, the metal fingers on her left hand cold against his skin. "It was an honor to meet you, Pythia." "May Clara bless you," he told her, gently pulling his hands away. "And may she guide your path," the woman finished. That was an email. Hold on. It might be important. 1 second. It wasn't important. Then she disappeared into the crowd again, her billowing gown shifting colors with the movement. The Pythia breathed a sigh of relief, allowing the fake smile to drop from his face, even though it was barely visible behind the veil. Despite how annoying speaking to guests like that was, he preferred it to the alternative of standing in silence, waiting for the next distraction. Because the second she was gone, his mind drifted back to the vision he'd had that morning. Dread crawled up his throat, painful and clawing as he struggled to swallow it down. His gaze kept darting towards the doors and windows, wondering what was going to happen. Because it was a when, not an if. Even though Schlatt had nearly doubled the number of guards that were supposed to attend the event, the Pythia just knew it wouldn't work. It was as if there was a cold hand on the back of his neck, raising goosebumps along his spine like Clara herself was trying to tell him he'd made a mistake. Taking a breath, he tried to shift his focus back to the present. Excuse me. He glanced at the guards surrounding him. Silent pillars dressed in dual-colored suits and animal masks to fit the masquerade theme. For the most part, the guards stood straight, keeping their eyes on the crowd. But he noticed one guard glancing his way, blue eyes bright behind the eye holes in his rabbit mask. Even though his own eyes were hidden, the guard looked away as soon as he noticed him, as if he could sense the Pythia's gaze on him. He wondered if the guard was new, or if this was just his first time being assigned to guard the Pythia specifically. After all, he usually just had 1 to 2 guards following him around the palace at a time. It was only for events like this that those numbers were bolstered to ensure his safety. Before he could think too long about the rabbit guard, though, there was the sound of shoes clicking against marble, followed by Schlatt's booming voice. "My dearest Pythia," Schlatt crooned, steps swaying in time with a champagne glass in his hand as he made his way towards him. "I got someone I want to introduce to you. They're a good friend of mine." Every person Schlatt introduced him to was a good friend of his. In truth, Schlatt probably didn't even remember half their names, and only knew them by what each one could give him. Money, power, social influence. Currency came in more forms than just cash these days. And Schlatt knew that better than anyone. He also knew that he had a more valuable form of currency than any of those things combined, and that was his unfettered access to the divine. So, of course, he didn't hesitate to take full advantage of it to gain the favor he wanted. Schlatt's black suit was embroidered with glowing gold thread, cutting up the arms of his coat and wrapping around his back in jagged lines. His own eyes, which were recently upgraded thanks to the palace surgeon, shifted between shades of crimson and burgundy, matching the satin lining of his suit. A black mask sat over his eyes, shaped like a ram's skull, complete with 2 horns curling out behind his ears and around his head. Suffice to say, Schlatt looked every inch the epitome of power and luxury his role as emperor made him. And yet, he still paled in comparison to the person following close behind him. A low-cut gown hugged their figure in a way that told him it had been especially designed for them. The fabric was sleek and lined with thin ridges, shifting between shades of gold and orange in such a perfect gradient. It was almost reminiscent of a sunset. Through the cutouts in their sleeves, tattoos of shimmering gold snakes wrapped around their arms, complementing the gold Ouroboros necklace that settled itself in the center of their chest. Their face was obscured by a gold masquerade mask that was also, unsurprisingly, decorated with snakes. But even with the mask, the minute he noticed their pure white eyes, he knew exactly who Schlatt was introducing him to. This is Eret, King of Angia, Schlatt introduced once his guards had moved out of the way, so the three could all stand face to face. Behind his blindfold, his eyebrows raised. Angia. That's where Eret was from. He should have guessed by the wealth in snakes. Angia was one of the wealthiest countries on the continent. A hub of gold mines and fertile soil, want was not something commonly found in Angia. He remembered hearing something about a recent shift in power, which he supposed was Eret being crowned as king. It is a pleasure to meet you, Your Highness. He greeted. Wait, hold on. Never mind. It is a pleasure to meet you, Your Highness. He greeted with a formal bow, knowing it would be easier to pretend they hadn't met rather than explain to Schlatt that they'd run into each other a few hours earlier. Eret blinked, relief refilling their gaze as they smiled and returned his bow. It is an honor to meet you as well, Your Grace. Schlatt glanced between them, smiling like he was already planning what he'd do with Eret's money if any kind of formal alliance came out of this connection. Well, I'll let you two chat a bit. My glass needs some refilling. Despite the drunken slur to his words, he flashed the Pythia a pointed look as he wandered back into the crowd, a silent reminder what his job here was. To be the ideal songbird in a gilded cage, showing off his pretty plumage and flattering the guests Schlatt brought to him. Anxiety still buzzed under his skin. He forced himself to ignore it as he shifted his focus back to Eret. Thank you for not mentioning our run-in earlier today, they said as soon as Schlatt was out of earshot. I was actually supposed to share a drink with your emperor at that time, but told him I decided to take a nap in my room instead. Oh. Well, he couldn't blame Eret for that. Very understandable. Schlatt can be a bit much to deal with when he's been drinking, he acquiesced, keeping his voice low as he watched Schlatt stumble through the crowd. Eret chuckled. Yes, I've been warned of that. They paused, a conspiratorial smile flickering over their face as they leaned closer to his face. If you've had any visions about this ball, let me know if he's gonna fall into the table or spill someone's drink. I'm desperate for any sort of entertainment at this thing. I'd rather not miss something like that. Although a part of him wanted to laugh at the mental image of that, the reminder of his vision only served to cast a dark shadow over his mood once again. For a moment, he considered warning them, because once things went to hell, everyone inside the atrium was going to be put at risk, including Eret. Schlatt was aware of the risk he was taking, but no one else in the room was. Eret deserved a chance to get out while they still could. But again, the visions the Pythia received were only meant to be shared with the current reigning monarch. Any breach of this was to go against Clara herself. He couldn't say a word to Eret. Unfortunately, I haven't had any visions like that about today, he said instead, figuring it wasn't an outright lie. Eret didn't seem to notice the worry gnawing at his insides. They let out a short laugh before their smile faded, turning to something more serious. Actually, I am curious about one thing, if you're able to tell me. They began, dropping their voice. How often do you receive visions from Clara? Is it something that happens every night, or is it far rarer than that? Something tells me Eric's part of the Deathlings. And he's like, no, and they're like a spy or something. Oh. He should have known this was coming. Even if some were more subtle, everyone who met him eventually asked about his abilities. The ruler of a rival nation was no exception. On the surface, the question seemed rather innocuous, but the Pythia had been in the game long enough to know what Eric was really asking with their question. They wanted to know how likely it was that he would receive warnings about the future if, say, a rival nation was to make a move against his own. Eric had been playing coy. He supposed the snakes wrapping around their arms were there for a reason. It entirely depends on her will, the Pythia began, choosing his words with the care of walking through a minefield. If she deems it necessary, I can receive visions every single night for weeks on end. But it's more common for me to receive 1 or 2 a month. Surprise flashed over their face. Oh, that's far less often than I thought. And are your visions for the near future? Like something that might happen in the next few days? Or can you see further out than that? Grateful his veil hid his grimace, the Pythia shrugged. Again, it depends on Clara. Most often they're for the near future, but I've received visions months, even years in advance if we need that extra time to prepare for whatever event she shows me. Truthfully, the furthest out he'd ever received a vision was 10 months in advance. It was of Schlatt's coronation ceremony. His father was still emperor at the time, so the vision told him that either he was going to abdicate soon, or he was going to pass away. It turned out to be the latter. The emperor hadn't made any plans to abdicate, but the warning allowed him to prepare for the power shift and ensure Schlatt was ready to take the throne. Then, when his illness struck, they all knew what was coming, and the plans had already been set. It made the whole situation much easier than it would have been otherwise. Where is it? He hadn't even been the Pythia for a full 2 years when that happened. To this day, it still remained one of the most terrifying visions he'd ever reported to the reigning monarch. Fascinating, Eret murmured, fiddling with their necklace. How clear are these? Suddenly, Eret's question was cut off by a deafening gunshot. And then, the screaming began. The Pythia's heart leapt into his throat as his visions began to play out in front of him. A sea of colorful gowns and suits swelling like waves, panicked cries filling the air and drowning out everything else around him. The guards surrounding him tightened their circle, pushing him and Eric close together as they used their bodies to shield the two of them from any potential threats. His head whipped to the front of the atrium. A tall platform had been set up for Schlatt to give a speech near the end of the night, and that was where the sound of the gunshot had come from. It only took him a moment to spot the culprit, and the minute he laid his eyes on them, a rock dropped into his gut. Schlatt was standing on the platform, along with 2 men who seemed wholly out of place amidst the opulence. The taller of the two men bright pink hair poking out from behind a metal boar mask he was wearing to cover his face, had Schlatt in a headlock. In one of his hands, the offending gun was pressed against Schlatt's temple, while the other hand was being used to keep Schlatt from struggling in his grip. The other man, meanwhile, was walking towards the mic that sat at the front of the platform. His build was much less intimidating than the pink-haired man, but what he lacked in size, he made up for with the metal wings he wore on his back. The mechanical wings were unlike anything the Pythia had seen before. They stretched out much further than he expected, wires and carefully carved feathers slotting together so perfectly. They had clearly been made by a master of mechanical engineering. The metal feathers shimmered with the telltale signs of enchantment, and he was so distracted by them that he almost forgot to look at the man's face. Almost. Admittedly, the man's face was covered by a similar mask to the one the pink-haired man wore, although this one was carved to look like a crow rather than a boar. It seemed he was keeping to a theme with the wings. The guests were still screaming. It seemed as though they'd reached the doors, only to find they were locked. He could hear a few people banging against them, but the metal was impossible to break through. They were trapped. "Good evening, everyone." The crowman's voice suddenly echoed out over the crowd. "I understand you're a bit alarmed by this change in your evening plans, but if you stop trying to break down the door, I promise we won't take up too much of your time." The screaming didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. The crowman nodded to the man with the gun, and the Pythia braced himself as he moved the gun away from Schlatt's head for just a moment, before firing it straight at the wall. "Quiet!" he shouted, placing the barrel of the gun against Schlatt's temple once more. This shut everyone up real quick. "Better," the crowman acknowledged. "Now, as I was saying, we don't want to take up too much of your evening. We're simply here to make an announcement with the help of Emperor Schlatt here." There was an echo of gasps as everyone else noticed Schlatt's compromised position for the first time. The Pythia felt Arid stiffen beside him. He tried not to look their way. Despite the terror coursing through his veins at the reality of the situation, he couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction when he saw the fear playing over Schlatt's face. He'd chosen to ignore Claire's warning, and now he was paying the price. Fuck, what was wrong with him? That was his emperor. He shouldn't be happy that his life was in danger. Now, the crowman's voice cut in before he could fall into a crisis over his own morality. We don't want to hurt anyone tonight. We don't want to hurt anyone tonight. So as long as you don't give us a reason to, we should all... The Pythia felt a hand tap on his shoulder. "We need to get you out of here," a guard whispered in his ear. "We don't want to draw their attention, so just follow me through the crowd. I have a way out." I have a feeling that was actually Tommy dressed up as a guard. But we'll see. I won't change the accent just yet. Oh, that's right. Of course there were emergency plans in place to get the Pythia out of a situation like this. As subtly as he could, he nodded and turned to follow the guard who whispered to him. The other guards stayed in place, clearly not wanting to draw more attention by all moving at once. Arid noticed his movement and raised an eyebrow. When they saw what he was doing, though, They gave him a small nod before stepping between him and the platform. With their heels, they were the same height as him, and blocked him from view as the guard led him through the crowd. He could hear the crowman still speaking into the microphone, but wasn't paying attention to what he was saying. Instead, he focused on keeping his shoulders hunched and head low, following the hand wrapped around his wrist as the other guests moved to the side to let them through. His heart was still pounding. No one said a word to draw attention to his escape. The other guests pointedly kept their eyes on the stage, and he silently thanked everyone around him for the understanding. Eventually, he and the guard reached the back of the atrium. There was a door embedded into the wall, half hidden behind a curtain of green vines that hung from the ceiling. The guard dug a rune key from his pocket, and the lock shimmered purple as the runes inside were activated to unlock. The crowman was still talking as the guard yanked him through the door, only going silent when it hissed shut behind them. And just like that, he was out. The Pythia leaned against the wall, a wave of relief washing over him as the metal over his head clinked with the movement. He took a moment to count his breaths, sending silent prayers of thanks to Clara for keeping him safe. "We need to get going." A voice cut through his breathing exercises. Opening his eyes behind the blindfold again, he saw the guard shifting from foot to foot, eager to move. Only now did he realize that the guard that had grabbed him was the one wearing the rabbit mask, whose bright blue eyes he'd caught glancing his way earlier in the night. The door they had escaped through opened into a narrow, dark hallway. Dim emergency lights lit up the bottom of the wall, casting the guard's split red and gray suit in a purple glow. "Where are we going?" the Pythia asked as he pushed off the wall to follow the guard down the hall. The guard's boots clicked against the marble floor in time with his own leather dress shoes. Although the guard didn't grab his wrist again, he kept glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure he was still following. Okay, something tells me this is Tommy, so I'm gonna change the accent. "Somewhere safe," the guard answered after a beat. That was strangely vague. There was a plan in place for situations like these. Safe rooms located throughout the palace where both the Emperor and the Pythia could take refuge should an emergency occur. He had been told this many times over the years, that his safety was considered just as important as the Emperor's, and the guards would do everything in their power to get him to one of those safe rooms should the need arise. The guard's answer shouldn't have been vague. "Which bunker are you taking me to?" he asked, pausing mid-step. The guard's walk paused as well, and his eyes were narrowed behind his mask when he glanced back at him. "The one on the first floor," he said after a beat. The Pythia narrowed his eyes. "There isn't one on the first floor." Another moment of silence passed. The Pythia's blood roared in his ears. I meant the one on the second floor." Immediately, the Pythia yanked his hand out of the guard's grip, stumbling backwards. "You're not a real guard," he gasped, a rock dropping into his gut. "What? Yes, I am." The guard stepped towards him, and he felt his back hit the wall of the hallway. "If you were, you would have known the entrance to the largest safe room is on the first floor. But you wouldn't be taking me there, because the one in the east wing of the palace is far closer to the atrium." The guard stared for a moment, blue eyes blown wide behind his mask. It was then the Pythia looked down at the hand outstretched between them. The prosthetic was made of intricately carved metal, covered in vines and flowers twisting together with the shimmer of enchantments reflecting in the purple glow. And although the guard's sleeve was covering his wrist, He knew that in the place where metal met flesh, there was a pair of dark angel wings tattooed on his skin. He was right. This wasn't a real guard. This was a deathling. Look, I'm not gonna hurt— Help! He shouted, turning to run back for the door they entered into the hallway from. I need— He was cut off by hands grabbing his shoulders. The fake guard was much stronger than he was, and he quickly found himself pinned to the wall with a metal hand slammed over his mouth, the pearls on his veil digging into his chin and lips. Don't shout, the fake guard snapped. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. But I'd rather do it the easy way because I'm not going to hurt you. Because behind his blindfold, he scowled at the fake guard, hoping he'd feel his annoyance even if he couldn't see it. Look, just— The fake guard hesitated. I'm gonna take my hand off your mouth to try and talk to you. If you shout again, then I'll have to go to plan B, which is the hard way of doing things. A beat passed. The Pythia narrowed his eyes before giving a small nod. Letting out a breath, the fake guard carefully took his hand off his mouth, but kept him pinned to the wall so he couldn't move. The Pythia considered shouting again, but he was interested in hearing what this guy had to say first. Okay, you're quiet. That's good, the fake guard murmured. Now, Pythia. He cut himself off, furrowing his brows. Actually, what's your name, man? I feel weird just calling you the fucking Pythia. His name? He stared at the fake guard for a moment, cold creeping up his chest as he realized this guy wasn't joking. He was actually asking what his name was. The fake guard didn't know. I don't have a name, he answered after a moment, the words slipping out as if he was on autopilot. I gave it up when I became the Pythia. It sat in the back of his head. His name. It was nothing more than a sound to him now. It wasn't him because he wasn't supposed to be anyone. He wasn't anyone. There was no supposed about it. He had to remember that. A beat of silence passed. The fake guard blinked, confusion dancing in his eyes. What the fuck? He then asked. What do you mean you gave it up? The Pythia is a vessel for Clara before anything else, so we don't need names, he continued, ignoring the lump forming in his throat. That's so fucked up, the fake guard exclaimed. He shrugged. It wasn't fucked up. It was just the way things were. Phil's gonna flip his shit when he finds out about that, the fake guard then muttered, making the Pythia wonder who Phil was. Okay, fine. I guess I'll just call you the Pythia. He paused, pressing his lips together into a thin line as he glanced around the hall. Again, I'm not here to hurt you. Then what are you here to do? Because I doubt you're taking me back to my room. The fake guard sighed. I just need you to come with me. Where? Outside the palace? Yeah, you could say that. The fake guard nodded. It's forbidden for the Pythia to leave their place beside the Emperor unless it's approved by the Emperor himself, he explained, clenching his jaw. I'm not disobeying the crown or my goddess, so you'll have to drag me out of it kicking and screaming if you want me to come with you. Fuck. His would-be kidnapper muttered, using one hand to dig into his pocket. Fine. I'm sorry in advance for this then. His eyes fell to the hand the fake guard had in his pocket. Sorry for what? He didn't get a chance to finish his sentence before the fake guard's hand was darting out and towards his face. He winced, bracing himself for the hit, but it never came. Instead, his neck stung. He opened his eyes, fear lancing through his body when he realized the fake guard had a syringe in his hand. Ouch! He yelped as the needle was pulled back out. What the fuck did you do? I told you this could have been easier, the fake guard replied, an apology in his voice. Before the Pythia could ask what he meant by that, his vision began to blur. Dark spots danced around his eyes, and his legs began to wobble as his muscles went slack. He stumbled forward, ears ringing as the fake guard caught him. You tranquilized me, he tried to say, but his words came out as more of an incoherent slur. I'm sorry, I didn't want to, the fake guard told him, slinging one of his arms over his shoulder. I didn't give you enough to knock you out, so just lean against me. As much as the Pythia wanted to argue, his mind was fogging with exhaustion, and he found he couldn't muster up the words to tell him to fuck off. This was bad, but also, he was tired. So unbelievably tired. He could barely stand and dropped almost all of his weight onto the fake guard. When they started making their way down the hallway again, it took all of his focus to try and put one foot in front of the other. Fucking death below, you're heavy as shit, the fake guard cursed as he dragged him down the hall. The purple glow lighting up the hallway made his vision blur further, and his stomach twisted. He was struggling to remember how to breathe, and his heartbeat was so slow, he was sure he was going to pass out any second. He needed to get away. He needed to try and run, or push the guard, or scream for help. But he could barely walk. His arms were limp, and he wasn't sure how he was even supposed to make his voice work. It was like a blinding fog had settled over his thoughts. He couldn't remember what he'd been doing before this, or why he'd been so afraid. All that existed right now was the endless hallway, and the warm body pressed against his shoulder. They walked, and walked, and walked. It felt like an eternity of walking. Each step was a mile. The very act of lifting his foot was like pushing a boulder. He'd forgotten how to use his limbs. He was fighting to even think. Suddenly, he was being yanked to the side. A door opened, and the fake guard was pulling him into a small room. He groaned, readjusting his head on the fake guard's shoulder, and the guy shushed him. "Stay quiet," he hissed. It was then that he heard voices outside the door. Footsteps echoed along the walls, and he realized that this was his chance. He had to call out now before he was out of the palace. He opened his mouth, ready to try and slur out some cry for help. But as if he could read his mind, the fake guard slammed a hand over his face before he could even get a peep out. "Don't even think about it," he whispered so low, it was difficult to even hear with their faces only inches apart. The voices and footsteps got louder. A shadow passed under the door, and he knew he needed to fight back, to push his kidnapper away and slam against the door. But his limbs were far too heavy, and the fake guard was pinning his arms to the wall anyway. He couldn't try to move even if he wanted to. He just wanted to sleep. Another minute passed as the voices faded away. The fake guard breathed a sigh of relief before opening the door and dragging him out once more. "Let's hurry the fuck up," he muttered, wrapping an arm around the Pythia's shoulders as they resumed their walking. The rest of the walk down the hallway passed by in a haze. He remembered blurred lights, the glare against the rabbit mask covering the fake guard's face, the feeling of the pearls on his veil digging into the back of his neck. So many tiny details, but nothing that could help him. Finally, after what felt like eons of walking, the hall opened up into something that wasn't a full room, but gave them a bit more breathing room than what they were working with before. More emergency lights lined the walls, and through his blurred vision, he could just make out a door with the words "maintenance stairwell" above it. The fake guard grunted as he pushed open the door, a loud metal squeak echoing off the walls. They both stumbled inside, the fake guard barely catching him before he could fall face first down the stairs. "Right, can you do the steps?" his kidnapper asked. The Pythia shook his head. He probably could, but the bastard was still kidnapping him, so he wasn't going to make this easy on him. "God damn it," the fake guard muttered, rearranging the arm around the Pythia's side to better support him. If the Pythia could speak right now, he'd say something along the lines of, "That's what you get for drugging me." But he knew that would probably just come out as an incoherent slur, so he kept his mouth shut instead. The descent down the stairs was a struggle, to say the least. The Pythia made sure he was no help at all, going completely limp against his kidnapper's side until the guy gave up trying to support him and hoisted him onto his back instead. Death below, that jewelry makes you heavy as shit," the guard exclaimed as he hurried down the steps, leaning onto the wall for support. The Pythia's head lolled against his shoulder, the pearl veil rattling with the motion. "I'm taller than you," he managed to say after a minute of fighting to remember how to move his lips. "Oh, fuck you, man. I'm very tall. You're just wearing heels or some shit." "No heels," he shot back, words still slurred. "You're small." The fake guard made an indignant noise at this. "I'm not small!" It was kind of funny, seeing how easily he could piss his kidnapper off. In a way, the fake guard was more of a tiny dog than a rabbit, one that tried to make itself seem more intimidating by barking all the time. The mental image made the Pythia giggle into the fake guard's shoulder. Even though he couldn't see his face from this angle, he could practically feel the eye roll directed his way. They reached the bottom of the steps, and the fake guard grunted as he set the Pythia back down on his feet. He slumped into his side again, but forced himself to lift his head so he could see where he was now. It was some kind of maintenance room. Wires were embedded into the walls besides electrical panels, and there was a row of breakers flashing between green and pink. "Alright, this is gonna be the annoying part. His kidnapper muttered as he sat the Pythia down on the bottom step. He took off his split red and gray colored suit jacket, revealing a black button-up shirt with a leather harness settled over the top. He dropped the suit jacket on the stone floor and pressed a button on one of the harness straps. There was a mechanical click, and a pair of metal wings flared out from his back. The wings were much smaller than the Crowman's back in the atrium, but they seemed to be made by the same craftsman, feathers curved the same way and glimmering with enchantments. "I didn't know rabbits could fly," the Pythia mumbled, finding it a bit easier to speak now compared to before. The fake guard rolled his eyes. "I'm just cool like that, bitch." Before the Pythia could reply to that, his kidnapper was walking over to where he was sitting on the steps, and placed something over his head. His arms were limp as the fake guard tugged them through, fitting a similar leather harness over his own clothes. "What the fuck?" he muttered. "Don't worry about it," the fake guard said, grabbing his wrist to tug him to his feet again. "Come on, we don't have much time. The Pythia could only stumble along as his kidnapper dragged him out of the maintenance room and onto an empty train platform. Despite the fog that still settled over his mind, he perked up seeing the low blue lights illuminating the monorail, recognizing this as the platform that deliveries, and less often visitors, came in and out of the palace on. There was no one on the platform, and the Pythia realized this was because nearly the entire system was automated. The security cameras in the upper corners of the walls were black, clearly having been shut off by the Deathlings before they began their attack. The main entrance doors to the platform were shut as well, leaving the only exit from the platform as the train tunnel itself. The fake guard dragged him along the side of the tunnel, the Pythia's vision blurring when he tried to focus on the light of the city at the end. It was taking all his effort to remain upright, and while he could have just gone limp and dropped to the floor, his kidnapper made it clear he could and would carry him if he needed to. At least this way the Pythia could see where they were going. It didn't take long for them to reach the edge of the tunnel. The fake guard stopped walking, the Pythia almost bumping into his back. This was as far as they could go if they weren't on a train. The rail was far too narrow to walk on, and it hung over a vast stretch of empty air. Below them, the city lights glittered like neon stars, and the Pythia's stomach lurched, realizing just how close they were to the edge of the platform. Okay, now this is the part when you really don't want to try anything with me, because you'll probably fall to your death if you do, and I don't think either of us want that to happen, the fake guard said, turning back to face him. That harness you're wearing has a hook. I'm going to use it to attach you to me right here, he explained, holding up a metal clip on the front of his own harness. We'll jump off and glide down to the street. And from there, it should be pretty easy to get where we need to go. Sound good to you? For a moment, the Pythia's hazy mind struggled to process what his kidnapper has just told him. Then, he registered the words jump off and glide down, and felt all the air leave his lungs at once. You're fucking insane, he exclaimed, some of the fog dissipating as his heart began to pound in his chest again. I'm not jumping off this thing. He scrambled backwards, his back hitting the train tunnel wall. The fake guard tried to step towards him, but he reached out and shoved him back as hard as he could in his inebriated state. The guard stumbled, arms waving as his heels hit the edge of the platform. Fear lanced through the Pythia as he realized the guy might fall, but before he could reach out and try and grab him, the fake guard righted himself and rushed back onto the platform fully. He looked up, his eyes narrowed behind the mask. Suddenly, the Pythia was being slammed into the tunnel wall again. He grunted as the fake guard twisted his arm behind his back and tried to ignore the pain of the metallic thread of his veil cutting into his cheeks as his face was pressed against stone. Do you want me to fucking drug you again? The fake guard asked, hooking their harnesses together. I don't want to do that, but we're past the walking bit, so I really don't need you awake anymore. Do you want to be knocked out? No, he forced out, feeling blood well up on his face from his veil. Please don't. The idea of being knocked out completely, of everything going dark and waking up without any idea where he was, scared the living shit out of him. Soon, he was going to be surrounded by Deathlings. Even if they covered his head or something, he needed to at least have some idea of where he was being taken. Okay, so you won't try to push me again? Because that was just rude. I won't, A beat passed. Then, the fake guard hummed, and the hands holding him disappeared. He almost collapsed to the floor, taking a deep breath as the veil fell away from his face and stopped cutting into his skin. He could feel tiny drops of blood welling up along his cheeks, but did his best to ignore it as he struggled to walk with the fake guard. Their harnesses were hooked now, so there was only a few inches between his back and the fake guard's chest. This made walking even more difficult than it already was, and he was relieved the edge of the platform was only a few feet from the tunnel wall, so they didn't have to do an awkward shuffle for more than a few steps. The tips of the Pythia's shoes sat right over the edge. His breath caught in his throat as he looked down at the city below, wondering if this was going to be the last thing he saw before he died. Ice-cold wind buffeted his veil, stinging the cuts on his cheeks. His thin shirt did little to protect him from the chill, so he wasn't sure if the shudder that ran up his spine had more to do with the cold or his own fear. Probably both. "Hey man, it's gonna be fine," the kidnapper reassured him in a surprisingly gentle voice. "We're about to jump off a fucking building. This doesn't feel very fine to me," he snapped back. "Trust me, I've done this a ton of times before." A warm hand fell on his shoulder, and the Pythia hated how he was relieved for the little bit of protection from the cold. There was a jarring contrast between the tranquilizer fighting to keep him calm, and every cell in his body trying to panic at the same time. He took a shaky breath, hating how his heart wasn't pounding even though he knew it should have been. "Okay," he breathed, shutting his eyes for a moment. "Okay, do I just..." Before he could finish his sentence, the same hand on his shoulder moved, and suddenly he was being pushed off the edge. Wind whipped past his face and howled in his ears. It cut through his clothes, chilling him to the very bone. A scream tore from his throat as the ground began to rush at him. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't process anything but the speed. This was it. He was going to die. He would die, and Clara would need to find a new vessel, and he would have failed his goddess. Suddenly, there was the sound of metal shifting against metal, and just like that, he was jolted backwards with a force so violent it knocked all the air right out of his lungs. He gasped as they lifted away from the ground. The harness dug into his chest and he scrambled to grab onto the leather straps, trying to relieve the pressure on his arms. They lifted further away from the ground, gliding between skyscrapers as they left the palace far behind them. It was all a blur of neon lights and holographic billboards as they flew down, 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 deeper and deeper into the city. At one point, the fake guard banked to the left, the grip he had on the Pythia's arms tightening enough to make him wince. A dark alleyway nestled between rows of brick buildings came into view. They flew closer to the ground, and it took the Pythia far too long to realize this meant they were going in for a landing. When they were only a few feet above the pavement, the fake guard pulled up, likely to try to land on his feet. Instead, though, the Pythia's own shoes brushed the ground, and suddenly he was being slammed straight into the ground. Fuck. Shit. Asphalt. Fucking shit. 1 minute, they had been above the entire city. The next, the Pythia found the pearls on his veil cutting into his cheeks again as the smell of wet asphalt filled his nose. His palms stung from where he had tried to catch himself. His side throbbed from the fake guard elbowing him as they fell. Above him, there was a loud groan. "You're a fucking idiot," the fake guard mumbled, splayed across the Pythia's back. "It's not like you fucking told me how to land," he grumbled in response. "You just pushed me off." The fake guard was silent for a moment. Then, There was a clicking sound as he unhooked the harnesses and rolled off the Pythia's back and onto his knees. Head spinning from both the tranquilizer and the fall, the Pythia didn't even try to fight as his kidnapper grabbed his shoulders and sat him up against the alley wall. Every bone in his body ached. The cuts on his arms, legs, and face all stung in the cool night air. He was so out of it because of the fall that it took him nearly a full minute to realize what had happened. Eyes flying open, the Pythia's head whipped around, trying to see where they'd landed. The alley was dark, the asphalt littered with puddles. The putrid stench of garbage curled around his nose, the culprit being a dumpster sitting a bit further down the alley. And for a moment, just a moment, he was hit with the strongest sense of déjà vu. The smell of garbage wrapped around him as he sprinted down the alley, shoes soaked through with rancid water from all the puddles he'd stepped in on his way here. Even still, there was laughter bubbling in the back of his throat and a smile on his face as he dove into the crowd outside the alley. Heat engulfed him as he squeezed between the pressed-together bodies, ducking under elbows and avoiding annoyed looks as he forced his way to the front. His head poked out over the shoulder of a man sitting in a lawn chair. Now that he could see the street, that meant he could also see the hover bikes lined up at the intersection, glittering in all shades of the rainbow as their engines hummed with anticipation. He smiled as soon as he caught sight of the bikes. There was a hover bike in the alley. The Pythia had to blink a few times when he first noticed it, just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating it. The bike itself was completely out of place. The alley was dark, dirty, and not the kind of place anyone would be if they hadn't accidentally crashed there. But the bike wasn't any of those things. Cherry red metal practically shimmered in the low light, so clean there wasn't a single speck of dust on it. His kidnapper was walking right towards the bike. "Is that yours?" the Pythia asked as his kidnapper unhooked a bungee cord from the back of the bike. "No, I'm just stealing this random bag off this bike," the guy deadpanned, lifting a duffel bag that was no longer secured to the bike by the cord onto his shoulder. He walked back over to where the Pythia was sitting against the wall, setting down the bag before kneeling in front of him. "Of course it's mine. Who the fuck else's would it be?" "I don't know. You're part of a terrorist death cult. You probably steal stuff," he muttered, slumping further back against the brick. Unzipping the duffel bag, the fake guard looked up to raise an eyebrow at him. "You know, assuming makes an ass out of you and me." "So you've never stolen anything before?" he asked, giving his kidnapper a doubtful look, despite the fact that he couldn't see it behind the veil and blindfold. "I mean, I have," he scoffed, taking a red hoodie out of the duffel bag along with a small piece of black fabric. "But you shouldn't fucking assume that." Before the Pythia could point out the flaw in his logic, his kidnapper was taking off his wings, the metal feathers slotting together to fold up into a small box. He placed the wings in the bag, and then reached up to take off his rabbit mask. Despite the fog still hanging heavily over his thoughts, a jolt of shock still ran through the Pythia the moment he saw his kidnapper's face. You're a child!" he exclaimed, stiffening against the brick wall. Maybe calling him a child was a bit of an exaggeration, but the boy couldn't have been older than 18. His cheeks still carried the barest hints of baby fat to them, offset only by a square jaw and broad shoulders. Along with this, without the suit jacket and the wings, the Pythia could now see how lanky the boy was as well, a mess of skinny limbs he hadn't quite grown into yet. In a way, it was eerily reminiscent of how he looked at that age, although he dismissed the thought the second it crossed his mind. At his surprise, though, the boy scowled. "I'm not a fucking child. I'm 18. And the deathlings let an 18-year-old kidnap the Pythia? He asked, the gold headpiece rattling as he straightened himself up. Yes, they did. The boy snapped, tugging the hoodie over his head. His blonde curls were ruffled by the gesture, sticking up in several different spots as he placed the rabbit mask in the bag on top of the folded-up wings. I don't even want to ask how old you are. I bet you're like, fucking 50 or something. I'm not 50, he shot back. The boy paused what he was doing, waiting for the Pythia to give him his correct age. He didn't. Along with dissuading outsiders from seeing the Pythia's face, it was also common practice for the Pythia to not discuss their age. Truthfully, the age of the Pythia didn't matter, because they were a vessel of an immortal goddess. Their predictions would be the same whether they were 14 or 80, but if a Pythia was younger, this could lead to outsiders taking their predictions less seriously. So he didn't offer his age to the boy, and after a few moments, he huffed and looked back down at the bag. The Pythia watched him pull out a piece of black fabric, tugging it over his head and adjusting it so it covered the lower half of his face as a mask. With only his eyes and hair visible, the boy then focused on him again. "You're really not going to tell me your name?" he asked, eyebrows scrunched together. The Pythia clenched his jaw. "I told you, I don't have one." "Still think that's fucked up," he muttered, shaking his head. "Whatever, you can call me Tommy." Tommy. Fitting for a teenager as brash and abrasive as he was. "What, are you trying to be friends with me?" he snapped without thinking. "You kidnapped me, in case you forgot. We're not sharing names and acting like buddies. I just figured you might want to know it since we're going to be spending a lot of time together." Tommy fired back, scowling again. "But I guess I don't need to know your name, since I can just call you a fucking prick." "Call me what you like. Doesn't make a difference to me either way." This only seemed to annoy Tommy more. The crease between his brows grew more noticeable, and it wasn't until he was reaching towards the Pythia's face that he realized what he was doing. "What? Hey, don't take that!" he yelled as Tommy pulled the gold headpiece off his head, instantly clearing up most of his field of vision. He reached up to try and stop Tommy from taking off the veil as well, but Tommy slapped his hands out of the way and yanked the veil off in one swift motion. "I can't ride around the city with you on my bike wearing this shit," Tommy explained, setting the veil and headpiece in the bag. "We'll be clocked by CCTV and set." The minute Tommy's eyes fell on him again, his mouth snapped shut. The Pythia was about to ask what was wrong, when he was reaching for his face, fingertips brushing lightly against the cuts on his cheeks. "Wait, did I? When you slammed me into the wall on the train platform," he explained, frowning at Tommy. "Also, crashing into the fucking asphalt certainly didn't help." Tommy yanked his hand away as if he'd been burnt. "Why didn't you say something? I wasn't trying to hurt you." And the Pythia found himself taken aback, because Tommy sounded genuinely upset that he hurt him. This boy, a deathling who wanted to destroy the very foundations their nation was built on, was upset that he hurt him. They weren't grave injuries, they barely even bled. It was just a few shallow scratches that marred his cheeks. At most, it would only take a few days for them to heal. Even still, the horror was there. It's fine," he stuttered, guilt festering inside of him at Tommy's obvious worry. "Just don't do it again." Although Tommy didn't seem to believe him, he nodded anyway. "Okay, I won't." It was then he reached for the Pythia's face again, much slower this time, as if to give him warning. For a moment, He was so surprised he could only sit still. But the second his fingers touched the edge of the blindfold, he was seized with panic. "Don't touch that!" he screamed, squeezing his eyes shut on instinct. Immediately, the hands pulled away. "Fuck, okay? Not touching it." Taking an unsteady breath, the Pythia brought his hands up to the edges of the blindfold to make sure it was still in place. He felt the fabric around his temples, over his nose and covering his eyelids. A few seconds passed, and as his heart began to slow, he figured it was safe to open his eyes again. He focused back on Tommy, who had his hands held up in mock surrender. Sorry, he muttered, dropping his hands from the blindfold. "I can't take that off in front of anyone. It's for your own safety." At this, Tommy frowned. "What do you mean?" Sighing, the Pythia forced himself to straighten up again. It's forbidden for anyone to see a Pythia's eyes. If they do, they'll be cursed. So we wear blindfolds that are enchanted to allow us to see through them, but keep our eyes hidden. Cursed? You'll die an early death, he explained, trying to force the tension out of his shoulders. "That's Kristen's domain," Tommy muttered, brows furrowed again as he glanced at the ground. Clara shouldn't be able to influence that." He considered this for a moment, before shrugging. "Whatever, I can ask Phil about that later. You keep the blindfold on, but the rest of your fancy shit is staying in here. Got it?" he asked, as he pointed to the duffel bag. "You're explaining all this to me like I have a say in the matter." Tommy huffed. "It's called trying to be nice, dickhead." The Pythia rolled his eyes behind his blindfold. "You're trying to be nice to the person you're kidnapping?" "Yes." While a part of the Pythia wanted to point out how those two things contradicted each other, something in Tommy's tone stopped him. There was nothing to laugh at in his answer, nothing sarcastic or mocking. Was he trying to be nice? Yes, he was. That's all there was to it. It didn't make sense. There was no reason for his kidnapper to be nice to him. Maybe inside the palace, Tommy wanted to keep things amicable to keep him from trying to fight back, but they were outside the palace now. And oh, Clara, he was going to freak out when that realization fully settled in. Tommy had won. He didn't have to keep up the charade. And yet, here they were, with Tommy still trying to be nice. "So, what happens now?" he asked, ignoring the tight ball that sat in his chest like a physical weight. Tommy, who was still digging through the bag, suddenly pulled out a wad of bright yellow fabric. "First, put this on over your shirt." It was a jacket. A windbreaker, to be exact. His fingers twisted into the airy fabric, but when he tried to lift his arm to put it on, it felt like he was moving through molasses. Every part of his body was unbearably heavy, and although it was easier to think than it had been back in the palace, it seemed as though the tranquilizer was still very much in effect. He struggled to get his arm through the sleeve for nearly a minute before Tommy had enough of it. Despite his protests of being treated like a child, Tommy ignored him and yanked both his arms into the sleeves of the jacket before zipping up the front as high as it would go. "Fuck you," he muttered, slumping back against the wall with a huff. "Are all Pythia this bitchy, or are you just special?" Tommy asked, zipping up the duffel bag and walking it back over to the hoverbike. "Trust me, I could be very pleasant company if I wanted to be." He shot back, eyes half-lidded as Tommy wrapped the bungee cord around the bag again. Tommy rolled his eyes as he hooked the cord under the bike, before making his way back over to the Pythia. "Yeah, I saw at the ball. You had all those rich fucks practically eating out of the palm of your hand. It's all a game of bullshit. They want to think they're special, that they're important enough for Clara to pay attention to them, and refuse to believe it when I tell them she has bigger shit to worry about than their corporate business. I don't know how you do it," Tommy said, crouching down in front of him. "I would have snapped and told them all to fuck off. Believe me, I want to... Hey, what are you doing? The Pythia asked, cutting himself off when he felt Tommy grab his wrists. Well, I'm sure the asphalt is really comfortable to sit on, but we can't stay here all night, Tommy explained, already straightening up. So come on, get to your feet, we've gotta go. Before he could try to argue, Tommy was yanking him up by the arms, his jelly legs immediately buckling under his own weight. A pair of arms caught him before he could face plant into the asphalt for a second time that evening, and he struggled to get to his feet as Tommy propped him up against his shoulder. How much of that shit did I give you? Tommy muttered, brows furrowed as he dragged the Pythia to the hoverbike. You're telling me you don't know? It was preloaded, Tommy exclaimed. Anyway, I'm sure you'll be fine. You're not dead yet, so that's a good sign. Now, can you stand on your own for just a minute? They were at the bike now. Tommy was glancing between it and the Pythia, as if he was unsure what to do now. Distantly, fear shot through the Pythia at the idea of racing on the back of one of those things, but he was far too focused on staying upright to think about it too hard right now. I'll try, he mumbled. Seemingly satisfied, the arm supporting him fell away, and the Pythia stumbled as his legs threatened to buckle again. He caught himself at the last second, though, and squeezed his eyes shut, ignoring the ringing in his ears and the sweat breaking out on his forehead as he put his full energy into standing. His heartbeat was quiet, but everything else in his body was so unbearably loud. The blood rushing in his ears, his breath scraping against the back of his throat, the bracelets on his wrists clinking against each other. It was too much. Too much effort, too much energy, too much. Tommy grabbed him right as he started to tip over. Shit, fuck, okay, you just need to climb on the back for me, got it? The Pythia blinked open his eyes again, and saw black dots dancing around his vision. Nausea twisted his stomach, but he did his best to shove it down as he used the last of his energy to lift his leg over the bike. In the end, he more or less fell onto the bike rather than climbed on it, but it did the trick. With a bit more help from Tommy, he managed to get himself settled behind the boy, and practically went limp against his back once he was sitting again. Can't pass out yet, King, Tommy said, even though he was far too uncomfortable to even think about sleeping. Grab onto me so you don't fall off. I really don't want to have to explain to Phil that I got the Pythia fucking pancaked on the side of the road. In his stupor, the Pythia managed to hook his fingers through Tommy's belt loops, and figured that was good enough. With a final nod, the bike hummed to life underneath them, the wheels lighting up in shades of blue and white as they lifted off the ground. The Pythia's stomach roiled as they pulled out of the alley and onto the main road. His head was spinning again. Panic and exhaustion combined, overwhelming every cell in his body until it was a struggle to even remember how to breathe. The dream had become the worst reality possible. He was out of the palace, and being taken to wherever the fucking deathlings wanted to hold him hostage. They could have any number of horrible things planned for him, and right now, he was too out of it to even try to get away. This was all Schlatt's fault. Okay, I'm gonna have to cut this like really abrupt. I didn't know if I was gonna be able to end this chapter, but I really have to go now, literally now for my rehearsal. That is in 10 minutes. I need to go. Okay, no raid. I will see you guys in the next stream. Don't know when that's gonna be. Okay, bye.